Hi, welcome to the bookshelf where we talk politics, philosophy, and religion from an African perspective. This is the deep dive series where we do a close reading of selected books from the bookshelf. In this season, we will be looking at Shawn Copeland's Enfleshing Freedom. In this episode, we will be looking at chapter 2 entitled Enfleshing Freedom. Copeland opens up the chapter by saying, "No Christian teaching has been more desecrated by slavery than the doctrine of the human person or theological anthropology." In this chapter, Copeland draws on the history and memory of enslavement to show just how brutally and easily the value and significance of the human body was undermined. To do this, Copeland starts by stating that theological anthropology holds three basic convictions that are derived from the Genesis creation narrative. First, human beings are created in the image of God, imago Dei, and thus have a distinct capacity for communion with God. Second, human beings have a unique place in the cosmos God created. Third, human beings are made in communion with other living beings. According to Copeland, slavery deformed these convictions. Copeland stated her goal in the following terms: to accord hermeneutical privilege to the black embodied being in the world, specifically of the black woman. To this end, she makes use of interviews from former slaves that contain what she calls the hidden script, the unofficial story. These hidden transcripts contest the public transcripts of the official story of slavery. Copeland says enslaved people put forward a counter-discourse which recognizes and defends their humanity, subjectivity, and agency. Copeland then discusses the different ways in which the black woman's body was objectified. On this matter, her basic claim is that slavery rendered the black woman's body as objects of property, of production, of reproduction, and of sexual violence. Popular discourse of slavery limits slavery to the operations of the plantation. Copeland contests this. Her contention is that chattel slavery was structured, sanctioned, interpreted, and enforced by the laws of the United States. According to Copeland, slavery was not just an economic discourse, it was also a legal discourse. These discourses endorsed absolute exercise of power by the white man over the slaves he owned. This power was exercised in four ways. First, the black woman's body was made the white man's property. Black women were bought, sold, leased, mortgaged as real estate. This was supported by the law of the land. Second, black women were objects of production. For the sake of profits of the plantation, enslaved women and men were reduced to instruments of labor, and there was little difference between the gender with respect to the labor that they had to do. Third, black female bodies were not only objects of production but also of reproduction. Slave owners put pressure on their female slaves to bear children as frequently as possible because this was much cheaper than importing slaves from Africa. This came at a serious cost to the health of the female slaves. They were still expected to work until hours from the time they would give birth. Fourth, black women were also objects of abuse. Copeland observes that slavery made the black woman's body sexually vulnerable and available. White slaveholders and any other white men would make use of the black female body to satisfy their sexual desires and fantasies. Resistance from the black woman meant death, but there were those who did resist against sexual advances. Despite being objectified in many ways, slaves resisted the objectification. Copeland describes how acts of violence and repression were met with acts of active and passive resistance. Black people resisted on three fronts. First, slaves freed their minds by stealing education. In those days, education for slaves was not only illegal, but it was abhorred by white people. Education of slaves was prohibited, and the penalty of stealing education could be torture or even death. Second, slaves freed their spirits through worship. In some plantations, slaves were not allowed to worship unsupervised. Some slaves did this despite the risks involved. They would pray for life and freedom, if not freedom for themselves, then freedom for their children. Third, slaves freed their bodies by buying their freedom. They would do this by working overtime or asking abolitionists to assist them financially. Some would exchange their freedom for the life or freedom of their loved one. Copeland says these acts of resistance were acts of redemption that aimed at restoring the black bodily and psychic integrity. Copeland brings to bear themes of freedom that came out from the former slaves relating their experience of the emancipation. She considers the existential significance of the emancipation of the freed slaves. These are the themes that Copeland highlights. Freedom from enslavement was freedom for God. Former slaves could now worship with no consequence. Freedom from enslavement was freedom for being human. Emancipation presented the opportunity to exercise agency and responsibility at a level that was unprecedented. They could imagine and build a future. Freedom from enslavement meant freedom for loving without restraint. Mothers could express love to their children in ways that they could not before. Spouses could love one another without fear of separation. Freedom from enslavement was freedom for community and solidarity. Despite being emancipated, Black people faced much animosity and racial aggression. Communities of former enslaved people formed out of a sense of community and solidarity of the struggle that they were facing together. Freedom from enslavement was freedom for healing and effecting psychic growth. Slavery was trauma to the Black body, especially the Black woman's body. Emancipation gave an opportunity to reclaim one's humanity and in the process heal the past trauma. Copeland then concludes by tying up everything she has discussed through a scene from Toni Morrison's Beloved. It is a scene of recreation. Copeland then brings to bear the theological themes in the story. Two things that Copeland claims to have achieved, and claims rightly so, is to have accorded a hermeneutical privilege to the enslaved woman's body and to have incriminated theological anthropology. Her theological anthropology has imposed a praxis and solidarity in the contemporary context. Please don't forget to share, like, and subscribe and comment. Feel free to also recommend any books that you would like me to do an analysis on. This has been our gang. Thank you.